Let's show you what's going on around the country, kids. On this Tuesday, the night of the Latin Grammys, sunny skies down through Texas, all the way from the bottom of Texas
to be completely honest, the morning of Tuesday, the 11th of September, 2001, started off as an extraordinarily boring one. Fashion Week was underway in New York. The morning's headlines featured stories about cloning, a lost spy plane, and the lackluster economy. Morning television ran celebrity interviews and feel-good stories. Everybody Loves Raymond was on its 6th season. There was a piece on CBS about retro American cooking. And really, that was as
I wasn't even born
as it got.
This time. 2001, I wasn't born.
It's too quiet.
35,000 feet in the sky at 9:24 a.m. Captain Jason Dahl, now 42 minutes into a routine 5.5-hour flight from Newark to San Francisco, checked in with Cleveland Air Traffic Control Center.
Cleveland United 93 is at your 350, intermittent light stop.
There's some routine back and forth, some talk about the weather, some talk about the traffic 12 miles east. Everything seemed fine. And then, less than 5 minutes later, that same air traffic controller received 2 radio transmissions that would come to haunt him for the rest of his life. Those distress calls, frantic, unintelligible screaming, were broadcast to everybody on the frequency.
1523, did you hear your company, did you hear some interference on the frequency here a couple of minutes ago, screaming? Yes, I did, 797. And
over the next few minutes, the air traffic controller tries desperately to make contact with the pilots, to no avail.
United 93, Cleveland. United 93, verify your level of 350.
As the plane began to rapidly change course before switching off its transponder, he knew that something was very, very wrong. And he was right. Flight 93, it would turn out, was the last of 4 planes to be hijacked that day in what would become a strategic and symbolic disaster and one of America's most enduring tragedies.
Wait, so, okay, first of all, like, do they not, like, have audio for the screaming? I guess they can't, like, send that out, no. Like, they can't really make that public, probably, right? It's probably just, like, some classified audio now.
But unlike the other planes, Flight 93 would never reach its target. Instead, it would crash into a field 65 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. And that left everybody with one question. What exactly happened on that plane?
No indication whatsoever that this very carefully coordinated massive attack was going to occur. There's been a complete intelligence failure here, and there will be a price to pay for that.
Thank you for your patience, ladies and gentlemen. We are now boarding all passengers and all rows. All passengers and all rows, please.
For 43-year-old Captain Jason Dahl, who's making his way to that morning's pre-flight briefing to begin prep for his 8 a.m. flight from Newark to San Francisco, today was undoubtedly a good day. You see, he was on his way back from ground control where he'd managed to charm his way into a behind-the-scenes tour. Even with his many years of experience, the magic of aviation still hadn't lost its edge for Jason. A well-respected standards captain, when he wasn't flying, he's teaching others to fly. And he was damn good at it too. Patient, even-tempered, and quick to make a joke to put others at ease, Jason was a particular favourite among his fellow pilots. He just made everything look so easy. And no doubt he had a little twinkle in his eye that morning. His
How hard is it to
anniversary was
fly?
just a few days away, so he just had to make it through a few busy days, and he'd be jetting off to London with his wife, where he'd be announcing his totally low-key surprise gift of a grand piano, something that was no doubt a topic of conversation between him and his co-pilot that day, 36-year-old First Officer Leroy Homer Jr. Though the two had never flown together before that morning, in many ways, they were kindred spirits. Leroy was a man with flying in his blood. As a kid, he assembled model planes, voraciously read every aviation book he could get his hands on, and he spent hours marveling at takeoffs and landings with his dad at MacArthur Airport near his home in Long Island. As a pilot in the US Air Force, he'd risked his life on humanitarian missions without falter, but now, as a United Airlines pilot, he'd earned himself a reputation as a soft-spoken family man with a polite and distinctly open-minded attitude, and some interesting war stories to boot. That morning, as the crew, consisting of 2 pilots and 5 flight attendants, went through their pre-flight briefing, the weather would have no doubt been a topic of conversation. Seriously, it was blue skies all the way.
Not one of them under the age of 33 as well. Is that kind of crazy?
They couldn't have asked for better. with decades of experience between them, as the crew made their way to their Boeing 757 to undergo preparation, they were likely as calm and collected as ever. 31-year-old first-class passenger Mark Bingham, on the other hand, was absolutely not. In fact, at the same time Jason and Leroy were doing their pre-flight checks, Mark was bombing it down the freeway while praying he wouldn't miss his flight. A gregarious and openly gay rugby player that stood at 6'4" and 220 pounds, Mark Bingham made an impression wherever he went. People
I'm not
loved
jealous.
him. Even though he now owned his own highly successful PR firm, he was markedly unpretentious and unusually resolute. Look, this was a man who had single-handedly fought off 2 muggers, walked right up to Tom Cruise and insisted on shaking his hand, and who, just a few months before this trip, was thrown to the ground while running with bulls in Spain. Twice. 10 out of 10 use of free will. But, you know, Mark had been out with friends the night before last, and it had been the kind of night that had ended with Jägermeister shots and the sound of birds chirping. So on this morning, nursing the last remnants of a hangover, he'd overslept. And now his friend, who was giving him a ride that morning, wasn't even sure he'd make it. But Mark really couldn't miss this flight. He's supposed to be an usher at his friend's wedding in San Francisco. And so as soon as he pulled over, he ran out of the car, through the airport, and finally, at the very last minute, made it onto the plane.
Damn.
On United Airlines Flight 93, Mark joined 7 crew members.
Have you lot ever
and
missed a
37
flight?
Passengers from
Like,
all walks of life.
been too late?
Passengers such as 79-year-old Hilda Marcin, who was heading to California to live with her daughter. 20-year-old Tosha Yakuge, a student from Japan who adored all things America and was determined to earn a degree in the States and become fluent in English. 38-year-old Richard Guadagno, a conservationist with the US Fish and Wildlife Service who adored all animals, particularly his own. A black German shepherd called Raven. 42-year-old Lou Nake, a charming but no-nonsense toy store manager with a predilection for fast cars, fancy wine and weightlifting, on his way to sort out an issue with a supplier. 21-year-old Nicole Miller, a college student and part-time waitress who'd made a last-minute decision to fly to the East Coast to visit a friend and was now flying back. The photo you're looking at now is of Nicole boarding the flight, happy as ever. It'll be the last photo ever taken of her. Of course, there are many more lives, many more stories than it's practical to cover here. But the point is, these were ordinary folks, just going about their lives, hoping that those 5.5 hours would pass as quickly as...
Who's the youngest here? I think the 20-year-old, right? Yeah, gotta be. Yeah. Oh, there's another 20-year-old.
Possible.
Yeah, people
While
of
the
all
8 a.m.
ages.
from Newark to San Francisco was never an overly popular route, the flight was unusually underbooked, with only 44 souls on board, including the 7 crew members, and a capacity for 182 passengers. The load factor was just 20%, so the plane likely felt quite empty. As they settled into their seats and stowed away their hand luggage, they had no idea that between 7:03 and 7:48, 4 terrorist hijackers had checked in and successfully made their way through United Airlines' 1 security checkpoint and were now sitting in first class. And though one of those hijackers was selected for additional security screening as part of the TSA's counter-terrorism program,
First-class hijackers.
that screening was only designed to detect explosives. Knives with blades less than 4 inches, of which the hijackers on United Airlines Flight 93 had plenty, were happily carried on board, as was the policy almost everywhere at the time. It seems unfathomable today, but back then, going through airport security was a relatively benign experience. Remember, airport security wasn't administered by federal employees, as it is today, but by private security companies. There were some bare minimum requirements, such as metal detectors and X-ray inspection systems for carry-on bags, but beyond that, security measures were largely at the company's discretion. The private security firm that operated United Airlines checkpoints at Newark Liberty International that day didn't even use closed-circuit surveillance. At the time, those working on the security checkpoint saw nothing that they deemed to be concerning or suspicious. And so, by 8 a.m., as the doors to the plane were closed and its massive 60-ton body taxied onto the runway to prepare for takeoff, the hijackers on board had defeated every single security layer that America's civil aviation system then had in place to prevent a hijacking. And everybody's fate was sealed. There's no going back from here.
What could they have done better? Like,
United 93 delays off the airport less than 15 minutes. Monitor this frequency for changes. Let me know when you're ready for the push. Monitor this frequency. Call you for push. United 93.
That morning, when Captain Jason Dahl checked in with Newark Airport's air traffic control tower, he learned that there was significant congestion. As it turned out, Flight 93 would have to wait its turn, a fairly ordinary occurrence for a morning commuter flight.
Facts.
Nothing about this recording stands out.
If you know,
Except,
you know.
Of course, the time. 8:14 a.m.
American 11, climbing table level 350. American 11, climbing table level 350. American 11, Boston.
Are they not communicating?
Air 7, Mike Lima, how do you hear?
Mike Lima has you loud clear.
American 11, Boston. This is Adam. This is Boston. I turned American 20 left and I was going to climb him. He will not respond to me now.
Looks like he's turning right.
Yeah, I turned him 20 right.
Oh, okay.
And he's only going to, I think, 29.
Okay. You want to answer you? He's Nardo. Roger.
All right.
Thanks.
Interesting.
American 11, if you're here, Boston Center, ident.
Had they already hijacked the plane by that point then?
American 11, American 11, Boston.
Ah.
"250 miles away, over at the Boston Air Traffic Control Center, an air traffic controller by the name of Peter Zalewski had just lost contact with the pilots manning American Airlines Flight 11, a domestic flight from Boston to Los Angeles. A controller with 19 years' experience under his belt, Peter's immediate thoughts were that the pilots just weren't paying attention. And so he spoke to his colleagues for advice. No one interpreted Flight 11's failure to respond as a sign of a hijacking. After all, in this pre-9/11 world, it wasn't unheard of for a commercial aircraft to deviate slightly from its course or for a controller to lose contact with a pilot for a short period of time. So the
thing is, it's so complicated to like be that person on the other end to understand like, oh, maybe that's happening. Like the chances of that actually happening, chances of a hijacking actually happening is so insanely like low that it's literally so normal to think, oh, they're just like deviating from where they would go. But yeah, unfortunately, that's just like the reality of it. Like, it's not his fault. No one's fault there. Just like generally.
Actually, he wasn't too worried. That was until Flight 11 suddenly changed its course. And then he started to feel uneasy. Perhaps he'd made a mistake, or maybe his equipment wasn't working. So he checked it out while continuing to attempt contact. And then, at 8:21, Flight 11's transponder, an electronic device that helps air traffic control identify and track a plane's location, was turned off.
No way.
Peter tried to push down the sense of dread he was now feeling, because the simultaneous loss of radio contact and transponder signals
was
a really bad sign. It usually meant a catastrophic system failure or a crash. But see, that didn't make any sense because he'd now managed to switch to tracking Flight 11 by a more rudimentary method, its primary radar returns. And he could clearly see that Flight 11 was still in the air.
Yeah.
And that's when he heard it.
30 man 67
Is that American 11 trying to call?
Buddy, we have some planes. Just stay quiet and you'll be okay. We're turning to the airport. 15 Southwest of Bono going to Hampton.
And who's trying to call me here?
Yeah.
American 11, are you trying to call?
Nobody move. Everything will be okay. If you try to make any move, you'll injure yourself and the airplane. Just stay quiet.
In later interviews, Peter would describe how he felt in that moment with precision. Not angry, not confused, but scared. Those messages weren't intended for him, but for the passengers on board the flight. Right there and then, Peter understood exactly what was happening, clear as day. Flight 11 was being hijacked. Trying to fight the rising panic, he screamed at his supervisor from his desk. And then for this brief moment, he looked around the room and he realized everybody was staring at him like he'd lost his mind. As the recordings were pulled and analysed, Peter remembered feeling so frustrated at how blasé everyone seemed to be. Nobody seemed to quite understand the garbled message on the tape, and the general assumption was that Peter was being a bit dramatic and had probably made a mistake. A hijacking was unlikely, to say the least, and an act of terror. That didn't even enter Peter's mind, let alone anyone else's.
Okay, but that's a little bit weird, no? Like, what I said before, it sounds like low, chance of a hijack even happening, right? But in this case context, they just said that nobody tried to move you, injure yourself, you injure the plane, etc., right? They're not communicating with them, they're communicating with the passengers in that way, and that's just out of the normality. That's very weird. With all the other things that are happening, I think that suspicion is allowed, right? Allowed.
See, while the events that followed and their underlying motivations are clear to us now, it's very important to understand that on that morning, they weren't. Whilst hijackings persisted globally, the threat of a domestic hijacking within the United States was mostly seen as a distant memory. And it wasn't that such events weren't taken seriously, it's just that at the time, they weren't really the pressing concern that, say, onboard explosives were. While there was a golden age of hijacking in the 60s and 70s, the last domestic hijacking in the US was carried out in '94 by a disgruntled FedEx employee.
But even so,
a rousing failure, frankly.
Even so,
there were expectations about how hijackings were supposed to play out too, namely that the hijackers aimed to land the plane, that they would issue immediate negotiable demands, and that they wouldn't try to vanish. The idea that anybody would use a commercial airliner as a guided missile while still inside it simply wasn't recognised on either an organisational or a personal level. Still, when Peter's colleagues began to piece together parts of the hijacker's message that morning, alarm bells did start ringing. While they didn't understand precisely everything the hijacker had said, they understood enough to know that they now had a rogue 767 hurtling through the skies. To make matters worse, the plane's sudden change in direction meant it was about to enter another centre's airspace, unannounced, and their method of tracking it without the transponder was severely limited. They didn't even know the plane's altitude. Peter and his colleagues had to get the message out across the system, and fast.
Oh, that's scary.
Now, if you're not really into planes or aviation in general, it's easy to gloss over just how vast and complicated this system is. But understanding it is key to understanding how everything is about to unfold. So here's the very, very simplified version. If you've got this video on in the background, you may want to look up. So, when a plane leaves an airport, it does so with a flight plan which has been put together by the airline's flight dispatcher, who are based at the airline's own operation centres. As the plane follows the route set out on that plan, its pilots communicate with a number of different people and systems along the way who will have received the flight plan ahead of time. First is ground control, then there's tower control, terminal radar approach control, but once the planes are en route and above 20,000 feet, they're passed by radio between any number of ARTCCs. Air Traffic Control Centres, or just centres as they're known, like Boston Centre. The USA has 22, and they are divided up like this. In the US, this is all overseen by the FAA, or the Federal Aviation Administration, a part of the US federal government mandated by law to, quote, regulate the safety and security of civil aviation. Now, the FAA has its command centre, which has general oversight of all US air traffic and sorts out any issues that affect multiple facilities. And then sitting above that and overseeing very broad, high-level policy and decision-making is the FAA's headquarters. 2 separate buildings, 2 separate functions, both located in Washington, D.C., around 30 miles apart.
Right.
So when a controller suspects a hijacking, other nearby air traffic control centres are notified, alongside personnel all the way up the FAA's chain of command, right up to their headquarters, where a designated hijack coordinator will contact the Pentagon's National Military Command Center to ask for a military escort aircraft to follow the flight and report back. The National Military Command would then seek approval from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And if they gave that approval, then those orders would be passed down the North American Aerospace Defense's, or NORAD's, chain of command. Now, NORAD is a Canadian...
I wonder how long this actually takes to, completely do. Because that's, a lot of steps, but in real time, how long does that take?
American binational military organization that was established in the 50s to jointly counter the threat of Soviet bombers. NORAD's job is to defend US airspace, and while plane hijackings fall within the remit of this mission, up until this point, it really only involved acting as an escort while the situation was de-escalated. NORAD's real concern at the time were cruise missiles and the use of aircraft to deliver weapons of mass destruction. In other words, things coming into the United States from the outside. Cruise missiles were hijacking, the chain of command was the same. NORAD alerted its American region, who in turn passed the request on to one of 3 regional divisions, in this case NEADS, the Northeast Air Defense Sector, and they in turn alerted any available defense sites that each housed battle-ready aircraft. Okay, so you didn't come here to listen to me talk about complex organisational structures or recount FAA terminology. Or maybe you did. I don't know. No judgment here. But either way, I'll cut to the chase, because there is a glaringly obvious problem with this system. This is way too long a chain of command.
That's what I was thinking.
Hijacking that is also an external enemy attack. And that's because nobody really expected the two to happen at the same time on the same plane. Like I said before, there were expectations at the time about what plane hijackings were supposed to look like. And it wasn't this.
The only thing more popular than me is Wild Natural deodorant.
Cherry Blossom. Oh, I wish I could sniff your pits.
What? Oh, okay.
It was completely unprecedented.
Christ.
And that was a huge problem because big, complex, nonlinear systems like NORAD and the FAA do not like novelty. They are presupposed on predictability, all the individual actors doing what they're supposed to do in a given way at a given time. Sure, systems like this have protocols, SOPs, chains of command for when things go wrong. But that's only for the problems that it foresees. What about the problems that it doesn't? Well, information gets lost. Small, ostensibly inconsequential decisions can have dire consequences. In short, inevitable chaos, or normal accidents if you really want to get into the weeds. Failures in intelligence notwithstanding, it was this, not exclusively, but more than anything else, that the hijackers were about to exploit. To put it plainly, the system designed to protect passengers that day and the protocols underpinning it were, quote, unsuited in every respect for what was about to happen.
Do you think they knew that or got lucky?
At 8:29, 15 minutes after Flight 11 had become unresponsive, Boston Center received a call from an American Airlines operations center to report a call they'd received from one of the plane's flight attendants about a possible hijacking. The call the American Airlines Center had received was from 45-year-old Betty Ong, and she was already operating outside of the system's predetermined protocol for a hijacking by calling them. The information she had passed on was horrifying. Several of her fellow flight attendants were either dead or incapacitated. Mace had been used for crowd control, and now the plane was flying erratically. Upon hearing this, Boston Center kicked into gear. Controllers worked together to move the other planes out of the way. The chain of command was notified, and supervisors at nearby air traffic control centers, at least the ones Boston thought Flight 11 might intersect, were informed of the situation.
Hi, Cleveland, New York, Boston. I got a little situation with American 11, American 11. He is a 767 departing Boston going to LAX. We don't know where the aircraft is going. We lost his frequency, then we lost his transponder, and now the aircraft is just west of Albany heading due south. Oh my goodness.
Minutes later, at 8:33, a third transmission was received from Flight 11. And this time, Peter made sure it was played out loud.
Nobody move, please. Going back to the airport. Don't try to make any stupid moves.
The whole place went quiet.
You can't.
Boston Center had no idea what airport the hijacker was referring to. They just knew they needed eyes on that plane.
You can't call cap on that.
By now, the information had made its way up to the FAA's headquarters, but nothing seemed to be happening. And that's because, for reasons that still aren't entirely clear, nobody at the FAA's headquarters had actually contacted the military. And so a controller at Boston Center decided to just break protocol. He made a few calls, got a phone number, and called NEADS, one of NORAD's regional divisions, himself.
Just weapons, Sergeant Powell.
Hi, Boston Center, Team U. We have a problem here. We have a hijacked aircraft headed towards New York, and we need you guys to, we need someone to scramble some F-16s or something up there to help us out.
Is this real world or exercise?
No, this is not an exercise manifest.
Okay, hey, hold on 1 second, okay?
Yep.
The guy can't believe it either.
Okay, I can't emphasize enough just how not in line with protocol just picking up the phone and calling the military is. And I think you can hear that in the controller's voice. But in any case, it's here with this controller that the first notification at any level was received by the military that Flight 11 had been hijacked. But it still wasn't enough. By 8:40, Flight 11 was fast leaving Boston's airspace, and their information on the more precise elements of its location was lacking. So they started radioing in to other nearby planes to request visual confirmation. And while only a few saw the hijacked plane, many of them definitely heard it.
New York, United 175, heavy.
United 175, go ahead.
We figured we'd wait to go to your center. We heard a suspicious transmission on our departure out of Boston with someone, someone keyed the mic and said, everyone stay in your seats.
Oh, okay. I'll pass that along over here. Hey, Kingston 93 line. Go ahead. Hey, United 175 just came on my frequency, and he said that they heard a suspicious transmission when they were leaving Boston. Oh, yeah? Everybody stay in their seat. That's what they heard as a suspicious transmission.
See, the hijackers hadn't realised it, but they'd broadcast that message to multiple other planes on the frequency.
Yeah.
When one of those planes, United Airlines Flight 175, another domestic flight from Boston to Los Angeles, moved from Boston Center's airspace to New York's, its pilots, trying to be helpful, made sure that the controller at New York Center was aware of the situation. And you can really feel that inevitable chaos that we talked about earlier closing in here. Remember, New York Center had only been informed of the presumed hijacking of Flight 11 just 10 minutes ago by Boston Center. This was their first time hearing about any radio transmissions, and it was secondhand from a plane that, well, was mere minutes away from disaster itself. This was a very common theme that day. Not every person working at every facility was operating with the same exact information. This was certainly the case at Needs, where, having now received a direct request from Boston Center to scramble aircraft, personnel were struggling to use Boston Center's intel to locate Flight 11 on their own radar scopes.
Okay, mode 3, 1443, last known. No, this is real world. Okay, run high check. I got a Z point, sir. Last known position. You know what? Just start hitting up tracks all around that area, that Z point. Okay, just north of SD, MCC, scramble Otis. Copy, same mission. MCC, I don't know where I'm scrambling these guys to. I need a direction, destination.
Not only did military personnel not know where to send the fighter aircraft, many weren't even sure whether Flight 11's hijacking was real world or exercise. On top of this, Boston Center's request to scramble fighters had been issued to Needs, effectively the bottom of the chain of command. Needs, remember, is a regional division of NORAD, and NORAD answers to the Secretary of Defense via the Pentagon's National Military Command Center. So back up the chain of command they had to go to get permission from their superiors. At least that's what was supposed to happen. In reality, the first-in-line superior, Major General Larry Arnold, saw how desperate the situation was and basically said, screw it, scramble now and we'll get the permissions later.
Yeah.
With that, while military ID checks were still attempting to locate Flight 11, at 8:46 a.m., two combat-ready F-15s prepared for takeoff.
There's a hunter with an active air defense scramble. Scramble immediately. Panda 4546. All parties acknowledged with initials. Command post.
Blake Bueller.
Tower.
JL on the tower.
Approach.
Tango Juliet.
Giant killer.
Solid Bravo.
All parties are cleared to drop. Juliet popping here.
It's kind of cool in a way, watching them coordinate. It's too late.
The World Trade Center, tower number 1 is on fire. All outside of the building, it was just a huge explosion.
10-4, all companies stand by at this time.
Engine 1 out of Manhattan.
Engine 1 out.
Engine 1 out, World Trade Center, 1060. Send every available ambulance, everything you got to the World Trade Center now.
10-4, 1060 has been transmitted for the World Trade Center. 1060 for the World Trade Center.
At 8:46 and 40 seconds, American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the World Trade Center's North Tower. killing everybody on board instantly and claiming the lives of many, many more. Though the military ID techs had managed to locate Flight 11 for a brief moment, it was too late. And everybody that was tracking Flight 11 watched as it disappeared from their screens. All said and done.
Okay, but say they got the aircrafts out on time and they managed to catch up to the flight. What could they have done after that? That's the part that confuses me. Like, shoot it down? I mean, that's quite a call, right? You have to be confident that. And in that scenario, do you know you had to shoot it down? Like, you don't even know where they're going until it is too late, you know? So, although it was too late that they scrambled the jets, what would have the jets done?
The military had 9 minutes to respond to the news of the first hijacking, the most notice they had before any of the planes impact. Word of the crash at the World Trade Center spread like wildfire. While early reports were highly speculative, many directly involved pieced together the two events fairly quickly. It was the worst possible outcome. For some, like Peter, who was now in the car park trying to fight back tears, the guilt was almost overwhelming. They had no idea how bad things were about to get.
United 175, recycle your transponder and squawk code of 1470. United 175, New York. United 175, do you read New York? Delta 1489, do you read New York?
Delta 1489, go ahead.
Okay, just wanted to make sure you read New York. United 175, do you read New York?
5 minutes after the crash, over at New York Center, Air Traffic Controller Dave Battaglia began receiving reports from his colleagues about a fire at the World Trade Center. But since nobody had said that it was Flight 11, he continued with his assigned duty of trying to locate the now lost flight. It was then that he noticed that the position of one of his other flights was no longer actively updating, so he made radio contact with its pilots, to no avail. That flight was United Airlines Flight 175, the same flight that had reported the strange message heard from American Airlines Flight 11. Dave, still busy looking for Flight 11, put Flight 175's behaviour down to the pilots not paying attention, just like Peter. He figured 175 would update their transponder code and make itself known in a few minutes. But then he noticed an unrecognisable transponder code in his airspace. 3321, and that plane was rapidly ascending. That frightened him, and so he contacted his colleagues to try and figure out what the hell was going on.
Hello? Do you see that United 175 anywhere? And do me a favor, you see that target there, the 3321 code at 335 climbing? Don't know who he is, but you got the US Air 583. If you need to send him down, you can. We have a hijack. We have some problems over here right now.
Oh, you do?
Yes, and that may be real traffic. Nobody knows. I can't get a hold of the United 175 at all right now. And I don't know where he went to.
All right. Okay, I'll see if I have one.
All right.
Okay.
United 175, New York.
So in Dave's mind, initially at least, he had two separate problems. Flight 175 becoming non-responsive, and a rogue plane operating on an unfamiliar transponder code flying erratically through his airspace. But then Dave received a vital piece of information. A nearby pilot identified the plane flying under 3321 as a United Airlines Boeing 767. Flight 175, Dave finally realised, was the rogue plane. Now, if you want to hear a senior air traffic controller locked in and at the absolute top of their game, there's truly no better example than Dave Battaglia on the morning of 9/11. I mean, seriously, I actually had to check that I hadn't accidentally sped the recording up when I was listening to this.
For 17,000. TWA3 Heavy, New York Center, Roger, good morning. Maintain flight level 220. US Air 542, reduce speed to 280. Delta 2315. Delta 2315, turn left immediately. Roger, traffic 1 o'clock, 10 miles, turning into your face, descending out of 31. It's a hijacked aircraft. We don't know what he's doing.
Left turn immediately, 200, Delta 20.
Okay, you can maneuver as necessary to avoid that aircraft, sir. I do not know what he's doing. US TWA3, traffic 1 o'clock, 10 miles southeastbound, descending at a 28.7. Okay, You can, DSR 542, fly heading at 290 now, radar vectors for your climb. Your Delta 2315, he's behind you now, you can turn right to heading at 280 and join the airway. Delta 2315, any evasive action you need to take is approved.
The guys sitting next to Dave listened on in horror. It was like something out of a film. Flight 175 missed 2 planes by 200 feet.
Jesus.
While nobody could figure out what Flight 175's intentions were, they knew about the World Trade Center crash but hadn't yet connected it to Flight 11, they could clearly see that the plane had now moved southwest and was completely off its flight path. At around 8:55, a manager at New York Center was updating.
Could you imagine the
situation,
stress?
And he began to initiate the hijack protocol, telling his supervisor everything he knew. And when that supervisor attempted to get that information up the chain of command by informing senior regional managers, he was told that they were discussing a hijacked aircraft and that they couldn't be disturbed. The idea that anything could possibly be worse than a single hijacking seemingly hadn't entered their minds. Little did they know.
Yeah.
American 77, Indy. American 77, American, Indy. American 77, American, Indy radio check. How do you read?
Oh my.
Over the next few minutes, yet another plane, American Airlines Flight 77, would go dark. This time, it was Indianapolis Center's airspace. A few minutes later, its transponder was turned off. However, unlike the other flights, Flight 77 was not found on primary radar. As the controller grappled with the disappearance of Flight 77, he had no knowledge of the other hijackings that had taken place across the system because, as it turned out, Indianapolis wasn't one of the centers on the original call made by Boston. Thus, the controller believed that American Airlines Flight 77 had, quote, experienced a serious electrical or mechanical failure, or both, and was gone. This information was...
Do you know what's crazy? Like, you got to think about like the chances of all of this unfolding the way it did. Like, not only did they get through security without, you know, getting detected or known or what they'd done or whatever, right? Nothing was out of the ordinary of what was happening in the security's eyes. They got onto the flight, they hijacked the flight, and they did that 3 times. 3. The chances is like...
communicated across the system, prompting search and rescue rather than hijacking protocols. The FAA headquarters would not receive word of the situation until 9:24, around half an hour after it disappeared, when Indianapolis Center started to doubt its initial assumptions and suspect, based on what they were now seeing on TV, that maybe Flight 77 had been hijacked. From there began a frantic search. Back at the New York Center, the supervisor, now panicking about Flight 175, circumvented protocol and contacted the next in the chain of command, the FAA's command center himself. No doubt this was a judicious decision given the circumstances, but it was nonetheless, just like the others, far, far too late. Still tracking Flight 175, one of the controllers at New York Center made contact with another, smaller facility who, in theory, if their data was correct, should have had a visual on the plane from their window.
Hey, can you look out your window right now? Yeah. Can you see a guy at about 4,000 feet, about 5 east of the airport right now? Looks like he's...
Yeah, I see him.
You see a guy, look, is he descending from the building also?
He's descending really quick too, yeah.
Well, that's
2,500 feet now. He just dropped 800 feet in like one sweep.
That's another situation. What kind of airplane is that? Can you guys tell?
I don't know. I'll read it out in a minute. Another one just hit the building.
Wow. Wow.
Another one just hit it hard.
Another one just hit the World Trade.
The whole building just came apart.
Holy smokes.
At 9:03, United Airlines Flight 175 crashed into the World Trade Center's South Tower. Unlike the first crash, every major news station now had eyes on the towers, and it was broadcast on live television to an estimated 2 billion people.
Yeah, now remember, oh my God.
That looks like a second plane.
Something many of you watching this video will likely remember all too well. Not knowing if that was 175 or another rogue plane that wasn't in their airspace, the manager at New York Center decided to just cut to the chase and call the military via needs, just as Boston Center had done. This was the first indication that Need's air defenders had of the second hijack. You'll recall earlier that Peter Zalewski and his colleagues were struggling to understand the precise wording used within the messages broadcast by Flight 11's hijacker. Well, just as Flight 175 hit the second tower, they figured it out. The hijacker had said, "We have some planes," plural. Shortly after this, at 9:05, Boston Center immediately instructed...
Wait, hold on. Let me read that. I thought they were going to say all of it. We have some planes, just stay quiet and you'll be okay. We are returning to the airport, okay.
The hijacker had said, "We have some planes," plural. Shortly after this, at 9:05, Boston Center immediately instructed all of its controllers to inform all aircraft in their airspace to heighten cockpit security, which they did. Then, over the next 10 minutes, Boston Center also asked the FAA's command center, the guys responsible for inter-facility management, twice to request that all air traffic control centers nationwide do the same. And there is no evidence to suggest that the FAA's command center acted on this
Increase the cockpit security
in any capacity.
I'll get the message out. Thank you very much.
And look, from here, things get really messy really fast. Indianapolis Center, still dealing with Flight 77, doesn't know about the multiple hijackings. NORAD, the guys above Needs, still don't know about any hijacking but Flight 11. Boston Center becomes concerned that yet another flight, Delta 1989, has been hijacked. American Airlines operations centers are an absolute mess, trying to figure out whether or not it was their missing Flight 77 that had just hit the second tower, or something else. And meanwhile, amidst all of this...
Jesus.
United Airlines, Flight 93, had reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Nobody aboard that plane had any idea of the growing chaos that was now ripping its way through the systems designed to protect them. 20 minutes earlier, at around 8:41, having waited on the runway for about half an hour, United Airlines Flight 93 was finally cleared for takeoff.
United 93, wind 3307, runway 4 left, clear for takeoff. Clear for takeoff 4 left, United 93.
Takeoff went as expected, and at 8:56, right as Dave Batilio was frantically moving planes out of Flight 175's path, United Airlines Flight 93 was instructed to climb to a cruising altitude of 35,000 feet by another nearby controller at the very same New York Air Traffic Control Center, whose airspace they were in at the time.
United 93, climb and maintain flight level 350. Leaving 28 to 350, United 93.
By 9:02, Flight 93 reached the requested altitude, and it stayed in New York's airspace for another 20 or so minutes.
United 93 starting to pick up some light shop at 35. Any ride reports? The first complaint I'd had, and United 93, contact the Cleveland Center now.
Middletown 69, up there, a quick question.
Morning, Cleveland. It's United 93 with you, 350. Just some light shop here at 35. Any ride reports?
No, just a little light shop, nothing worse than that, United 93.
What you're hearing is United Airlines Flight 93 being handed over to the next airspace on their flight plan, Cleveland Center. What you're not hearing is any sign of panic. And that's because Captain Jason Dahl and First Officer Leroy Homer had no idea about anything that had unfolded over the past hour. Even though 2 planes had now hit the Twin Towers, even though the White House had been evacuated, even though the FAA had shut down airspace over New York City, and even though multiple FAA airline officials now had an understanding that hijackers were going after multiple aircraft, nobody at leadership level had thought to use the vast network at their disposal to warn the planes that were still in the sky. Why? Well, according to later interviews, FAA officials thought it was the airline carrier's responsibility to notify planes of security problems, not theirs. This was, of course, news to the airline carriers who at the time were facing a, quote, escalating number of conflicting and for the most part erroneous reports about other flights, as well as a continuing lack of vital information from the FAA about hijacked flights. At 9:25, FAA headquarters had enough concern to order a, quote, nationwide ground stop, and to request that its own command centre, quote, get an awareness up to all traffic management coordinators or the traffic management units to report any unusual circumstances direct to the command centre of loss of identification or any unusual radio transmission, which demanded that air traffic controllers report on any problems as they arose and not try to prevent any further problems from happening. It's frustratingly myopic, but that's how it came to be that Flight 93's very last chance to be warned of the horrors that were about to unfold, very unfairly, rested in the hands of one man. Over in United Airlines headquarters in Chicago, just before 9 a.m, 63-year-old United Airlines flight dispatcher, Ed Ballinger, had just received word from his manager that a flight attendant aboard Flight 175 was relaying some very disturbing news. The plane had been hijacked. That flight, alongside United Airlines Flight 93 and 14 others, was one of the flights Ed was responsible for that day. Now, flight dispatchers are different from air traffic controllers because they work for the airline companies themselves. In very broad terms, they're in charge of putting together and monitoring flight plans, and while technically they have joint responsibility with the captain, communication with the plane is really only on an as-needed basis. Ed, as with every other flight dispatcher, quote, did not have the capacity to listen in on communications between his flights and air traffic control. So he didn't know anything other than what he'd just heard from his manager and what he and all of his colleagues were about to watch on a huge TV right in the middle of their office.
Yeah, now remember, oh my God.
That looks like a second plane come in just from the right-hand side of the screen. So this looks like it is some sort of a concerted effort to attack the World Trade Center that is underway in downtown New York.
We will see that scene again just
I can just imagine that just freaked
To Ed,
out.
a highly skilled dispatcher of 34 years, it didn't matter who was responsible for telling who what. All he knew when he saw those images was that there was trouble and that he needed to warn his pilots. He determined that the best and quickest way to get the message out was via ACARS, a digital data link system used to send short text messages between aircraft and ground stations. He took a brief moment to think about the best and most succinct way of phrasing it, and then he started hammering out the messages, manually typing and sending them, one by one. And in the middle of sending those messages out, a message from Captain Jason Dahl, with whom Ed was well acquainted, appeared on his screen. Good morning. Nice climb out of EWR after a nice tour of the apartment courts and ground control. 20 northeast west at 550. Occasional light chop. Wind 290-50 ain't helping. Jay. Ed fired back his warning message at 9:23. Beware any cockpit intrusion. 2 aircraft in NY hit Trade Center. At 9:24, that message, the first warning sent out by any of the airline carriers whose planes were involved in 9/11, was received by 2 very confused pilots. See, just a few minutes earlier, at 9:22, the pair had received a message from Leroy's wife, who, seeing what was happening on TV, had an ACARS message sent to the cockpit to ask if everything was okay. Confused at 9:26, Jason hit Ed back with the following message. Ed, confirm latest message, please. Jason. Just 2 minutes later, as Ed was writing his reply, the hijackers on board attacked the cockpit.
Do they not have locks for this?
While
I guess
the
it
precise
doesn't matter,
details
does
of
it?
the order of the attack aren't known, it's generally thought that it looked something like this. At 9:28, 4 hijackers seated in first class rose from their seats, tied red ties around their heads, and over a period of about 40 seconds, attacked and incapacitated first-class passenger Mark Rothenberg, threatened the rest of the passengers with a fake explosive device, ushered everybody to the back of the plane, and gained access to the cockpit, attacking both pilots and taking over the controls. The most likely scenario is that this all happened simultaneously, since, quote, taking over the cabin first would have likely alerted the flight deck to a problem, and waiting to control or move passengers once the cockpit was secured would have increased the risk of passenger intervention. Less than a minute after the last radio contact with air traffic control, Flight 93 could be seen suddenly descending, before transmitting 2 distress calls on its frequency in quick succession. The actual recordings are... yeah. They're bad.
Jesus.
Perhaps if the warning had been received earlier, there might have been a chance, however minute. But such as it was, Leroy and Jason were both strapped into their seats like sitting ducks, completely unable to defend themselves.
United 93, verify your flight level 350. United 93, verify your level of 350. United 93, Cleveland. United 93, Cleveland.
Okay, so back over at Cleveland Center, John Worth, the air traffic controller now responsible for Flight 93, had just become aware of multiple hijackings of the two planes that had now hit the Twin Towers. And he saw Flight 93 descend quickly, so he hit the loudspeaker before the second distress call. And everybody in the office heard it, alongside all the other planes on that frequency. At the exact same time, President Bush went live on television.
Apparent terrorist attack on our country.
Terrorist attacks. Of course, there have been rumors and plenty of inference up until this point, but to hear the words said by the President of the United States, well, you can only imagine the confusion and concern not only on the ground, but up in the air, too.
On the East Coast that we need to know about? Yeah, I'll keep you advised on that in a second. Amtrak 797, Cleveland. United 1523, did you hear your company, did you hear some interference on the frequency here a couple of minutes ago, screaming?
Yes, I did, 797, and we couldn't tell what it was either.
Okay.
An American 1060, a ditto on the other transmission.
The American 1060, you heard that also?
Yes, sir, twice.
Roger. 561 Alpha Charlie, keep your airspeed back to 250 knots and report reaching 370. We heard that also, thanks. I just wanted to confirm it wasn't some interference.
Now, John didn't want to panic the pilots, so he tried his best to appear as calm as possible. Deep down, though, he was terrified because he knew exactly what the hijackers intended to do with that plane, and he also knew that all he could do now was report to his manager and keep a track of it until the military could take over. And so that's what he did. He sat there and he watched the plane like a hawk, waiting for the hijackers to turn their transponder off, just like they'd done on the other planes. But his concentration was quickly interrupted.
They got some things to down. Keep remaining sitting. We have a bomb aboard. So it's
calling Cleveland Center, you're unreadable. Say again slowly.
It was the pilot hijacker, and the message, just like on the other planes, had been accidentally transmitted to everyone on the frequency, and not to the passengers in the cabin. Back at United Airlines dispatch, Ed and a number of other colleagues received word about the probable hijacking of Flight 93, and for the next 5 minutes, they began sending out more ACARS messages. But of course, there was no response to these or any subsequent attempts at contact. Jesus. Meanwhile, on the back of the plane, the passengers, now herded to the last few rows, were almost totally unaware of what was happening. Those first few moments after the hijacking had taken place must have been both terrifying and confusing, especially since the plane had just taken a roller coaster-like dip, losing altitude and then quickly regaining it. Once the plane leveled out, though, the first-class passengers began to exchange details of what they just saw to economy passengers, who likely would have seen very little from behind the curtains. Thinking about what to do next, and trying to push aside the growing sense of panic he must have been feeling, it seems that one passenger, at least initially, realised that the answer was staring him right in the face. The airphones. While most people had cell phones in 2001, at 35,000 feet, planes are generally above the effective cell tower range, which would have made them difficult, though not impossible, to use. The airphones, which just so happened to be placed on the back nine
all
rows
planes
of
have
the plane,
this.
though outrageously expensive, would have been far more reliable. And so, throughout the duration of the flight, passengers started making calls, a total of 37 to be precise. It's because of these calls that we have so much information about what happened on board that plane. The very first of those calls to connect was between first-class passenger 38-year-old Tom Burnett and his wife, Dina. And it was placed just minutes after the hijacking had taken place.
Jesus.
At the time, Dina was at their home, getting their girls ready for school while on the phone with Tom's mom, the two reassuring each other in the face of the images they were now seeing on TV that he was probably fine and that the chances of one of those planes being Tom's was minute. But then again, Dina didn't know the precise details of his flight. As the senior VP of a medical devices company, Tom flew so much that she just stopped keeping track. He said he'd be home today, on an early flight if possible, and that was all she knew. Not yet understanding the nature of the attacks, the two speculated that it was probably a major issue with air traffic control, and then the call waiting tone sounded. It was Tom, and he didn't miss a beat.
Listen, our airplane has been hijacked. It's United Flight 93 from Newark to San Francisco.
I thought it was going to be the actual audio.
His tone was quiet and matter of fact. He then went on to give Dina further details of the attack, that somebody had been killed, that there was a bomb, and that she needed to call the authorities right away. Her whole body froze. She actually had to remind herself to breathe. Okay, 911. I have to call 911, she remembered thinking. She made the call, and finally, through a series of transfers, she found herself on the end of the line with a confused FBI agent. She relayed what she knew, but before she could finish, the call waiting noise sounded again.
They're in the cockpit,
were the first words out of his mouth. In this call, while still remaining remarkably calm, he provided even further detail, explaining that he tried to help the passenger that had been attacked, but there was no pulse. Realizing that Tom hadn't been seeing or hearing any of what had been reported, Dina quickly told him everything that she knew, that people were hijacking planes all down the East Coast and hitting designated targets, and that they'd already hit both towers of the World Trade Center. There was a moment of silence on the line, as Tom processed what this meant.
Jesus. Imagine.
Oh my gosh.
In that instant, his grip on the situation turned from a nebulous fear to something far more substantive. Those hijackers had no intention of landing this plane. Of all the tickets, of all the flight routes he could have booked, he picked this one. But if there's one thing to know about Tom Burnett, it's that he wasn't the type of guy to dwell. A deeply religious man with traditional values who lived by a strict moral code, Tom Burnett had within him a streak of defiance, and he wasn't afraid to disagree with anyone. If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything, he liked to say. He had dreams of one day becoming a politician. He had so much conviction in the way things ought to be, and loved nothing more than to get into a debate with any willing participant. And he'd usually win. It surprised precisely no one that Tom's brand of fearless defiance had led to a sort of de facto leadership role that day, because, well, that's just how Tom was. And it's thanks to him and his wife Dina that the passengers on United 93 had a sense of what was about to happen as quickly as they did. Dina listened as Tom confidently and matter-of-factly repeated to other passengers what she'd said, including his seatmate, Mark Bingham. It was that information that Mark simultaneously relayed while on the phone to his mom.
Mom? This is Mark Bingham.
The stress had caused him to address his own mom using his full name.
I want to tell you that I love you.
He then relayed everything he knew in a calm, controlled and focused way, and he must have realised how outlandish the whole thing sounded because he finished with,
"You've got to believe me. It's true."
Of course, Mark's mom had been watching the events unfold on television, so she absolutely did believe him. Meanwhile, back at Cleveland Center, John watched Flight 93 climb from 35,000 to 40,700 feet while making a 90-degree turn southeast. He felt the turn deep in the pit of his stomach. There's no way that maneuver wasn't throwing people around the plane, he thought. And then he considered the trajectory, and he realized that plane was headed straight for Washington. It was around this time, 9:36, that everybody over at Cleveland Center started to become increasingly frustrated. Rather than waiting around, a senior member of staff called the FAA Command Center again and specifically requested military assistance for Flight 93, even threatening to just do it themselves if necessary. And the person on the other end of the phone reminded them that such a decision was well above them in the chain of command and that they were, quote, working on the issue. Meanwhile, 2 minutes later, at 9:38 in Washington, Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon, instantly killing 64 passengers, including 5 hijackers, and 6 crew members on board, as well as 125 military personnel and civilians. Its primary radar target was only discovered 6 minutes prior at 9:32 by the FAA, who would inform the military at 9:34, despite knowing of Flight 77's disappearance for just over 20 minutes at this point. Up until then, the only contact senior staff at the FAA had with the military was to inform them at 9:23 that Flight 11 was still in the air and headed towards Washington, meaning a second set of fighter pilots were scrambled and then airborne at 9:30, not to deal with Flight 77, but with Flight 11, a plane that no longer existed. Looking at Flight
Jesus
93's CPR
Christ.
transcript at this time, around 9:30, it's quite clear that the hijackers in the cockpit were becoming increasingly frustrated and frantic too. As they disengaged the autopilot, alarms started blaring, and there were more than 40 instances of one of the hijackers saying things like, "No, sit down, stop, and don't move." It's believed that this is because one of the pilots was still alive and was doing whatever he could to interfere with the hijackers or communicate with control, who could still be heard calling for him over the radio. On top of this, the voice of what is thought to be Flight Attendant Deborah Walsh can be heard in the cockpit. Though it's not exactly clear how she came to be in there, the CVR recording doesn't begin until 3 minutes or so after the cockpit was breached. The most likely scenario is that she was used to get the pilots to open the door. Realizing that the crew were no longer useful to them, the words, "In the name of Allah, most merciful, most compassionate," were heard, before the words, "Everything is fine. I finished." Deborah, Jason and Leroy were not heard on the recording again. Minutes later, at 9:39, the plane's new pilot, now all too aware of the need to keep the remaining passengers and crew compliant, attempted to make a second announcement over the plane's internal communication system. But of course, this
really
message didn't reach
horrifying.
the cabin.
Here's the captain. I would like to order the remaining details. We're on board and are going to back to the airport and to have our demand to remain quiet.
It reached every other plane on the frequency and John, who responded quickly with,
United 93, understand you have a bomb on board, go ahead.
Now, there was of course no response, but just as everybody was expecting, a few minutes later, at 9:41, Flight 93 turned its transponder off. And John knew this would happen, so he had no problem using alternative tracking methods. At this point, several passengers had open lines of communication, receiving more precise details about the other hijackings. One such call was between 31-year-old sales exec Jeremy Glick and his wife, Lisbeth.
"Liz, I need to know something,"
he said.
"One of the other passengers has talked to their spouse. He said they were crashing planes into the World Trade Center. Is that true?"
Staring at the images on the TV in front of her, she hesitated for a moment before replying, "Yes, they are." Meanwhile, at 9:43, over in Illinois at the Airphone Operations Center, Supervisor Lisa Jefferson was called over by one of her staff, who was in tears. The call, the employee had told her, was about a possible hijacking. With no idea what to expect, Lisa took the call. On the other end was a calm, soft-spoken gentleman. It was 32-year-old Todd Beamer, one of the passengers on Flight 93. Somehow, the phone had routed to the Airphone Operations line. Todd told Lisa what was going on, and then he started talking about his family, his 2 boys, and the one on the way. Lisa didn't tell him about the attacks. She wanted to spare him the grief, but she didn't need to. He and every other passenger on the plane already knew well enough that they weren't hostages who were about to have a crazy story to tell their grandkids. They were collateral damage, trapped inside a guided missile with no way out. That realization should have had most of the passengers paralyzed with fear, too frightened to think straight, let alone form any kind of plan. But it didn't. Okay, so at this point, the passengers were very obviously whispering among themselves, exchanging information and making multiple phone calls, and it really wasn't long, perhaps 15 minutes or so after the hijackers took over the plane, before the suggestion to take action was floated. We don't know who exactly suggested the idea, but we do know that it was a group of 5 men who would initially give the plan serious contemplation. Tom Burnett, Mark Bingham, Todd Beamer, Jeremy Glick, and a 5th unknown passenger who many believe to be Lou Nake. What's particularly strange about all of this is that the 2 hijackers responsible for keeping the passengers under control stood there and watched it happen. Of all the questions about Flight 93, like why the hijackers waited 46 minutes to enact their attack rather than the half an hour or less we saw on the other planes, this one feels the most glaringly nonsensical. Even if the hijackers didn't anticipate a delay significant enough for passengers to learn of the already successful attacks, yet another oversight given Newark had the highest delay rate out of any airport in the United States. By 9:41, an ACARS message would have reminded the hijackers that this was very public knowledge. So what do they think the passengers were talking about? Of course, you might say that the hijackers were simply relying on fear, a combination of their initial attack, a fake bomb, and an in-cabin announcement to maintain control. But one of those, the in-cabin announcements, hadn't worked. And the other, the threat of explosion, was now being seriously questioned. TSA was lax, but it wasn't that lax. And anyway, why would they blow up a plane they clearly had much bigger plans for? Nobody really has an explanation for this behaviour. It most likely just comes down to some kind of bias hardwired into the human brain that stops us from seeing what's right in front of us when we're under pressure. Who knows? What we do know is that just like many others that day, it seemed that the hijackers lacked imagination with regards to what human beings are capable of. And that error would prove to be catastrophic. From around 9:38, about 10 minutes or so into the hijack, the plane's manoeuvres were becoming increasingly erratic. It was around this point that a plan of attack began to really take shape. If they were going to do this, they'd need the biggest and strongest on the plane, and they'd need to act quickly. And just on that former point, they weren't exactly lacking for choice. There was an astounding amount of athletic prowess on board, and not just hobbyists either. There were martial art champions, wrestlers, weightlifters, and more. Of the 4 men we know were directly involved in the attack, all of them were over 6 feet and 200 pounds, and had been standout athletes at one point or another. Mark Bingham in particular was really not somebody you'd want to go toe-to-toe with anywhere, let alone in an enclosed space, 35,000 feet in the sky. Had this not been the case, I don't think the group would have been quite so swift in their decision-making. But it seems that by 9:40 at least, a plan of attack had been formulated.
But surely the hijackers have guns, right?
Told her about it.
No.
Listen, we're going to do something. I don't think we're going to get out of this thing. I'm going to have to go out on faith.
Lisa, hearing this and trying her hardest to remain composed, said, "Are you sure that's what you want to do, Todd?" To which Todd replied,
"It's what we have to do."
Shortly after this, at 9:45, Tom made his third call to Dina. She told him about the Pentagon, and he relayed the news to passengers.
Okay, and what else can you tell me?
5 planes have been hijacked. They believe all of them are commercial planes.
Do you know who's involved?
He asked. No, she answered.
Well, what is the probability of them having a bomb on board?
He paused.
I don't think they have one. I think they're just telling us that for crowd control.
Tom then asked Dina if she called the authorities. She told him that she had, but that they didn't know anything about his plane. If Tom and all the other passengers were getting the sense that they were on their own, it's because they were. By this point, a nationwide ground stop of all departures had been ordered, and senior managers all the way up to the FAA's headquarters were well aware of the situation with Flight 93, having successfully located the plane on primary radar. Staff at both the FAA's command centre and its headquarters knew they should probably contact the military. I mean, just listen to this call made at 9:49.
Maybe.
We'll talk about United 93.
Do we want to think about scrambling aircraft?
Oh, God, I don't know.
That's a decision somebody's going to have to make probably in the next 10 minutes.
And I'm sure you know how this is about to go. For reasons that are not entirely clear, the decision was never actually made, and the FAA failed to contact the military. And there was another horrifying reality to deal with too.
Jesus.
At some point, somebody had spotted the plane's pilots, Leroy and Jason, who'd presumably been moved outside of the cockpit. With all passengers now aware of the plan to overpower the hijackers, this fact must have been a real sticking point, because if they were successful, who was going to fly the plane? Well, as fate would have it, both a qualified pilot, Donald Green, and a former air traffic controller, Andrew Garcia, just so happened to be among the passengers. While Donald was only licensed to fly a single engine, not a Boeing 757, with a bit of help from ground control, his chances of safely landing the plane were actually pretty decent. This fact likely galvanised any passengers on the fence into action, because there was a chance. A small one, but a chance nonetheless, to actually take back control and safely land the plane. And it's around here that they did something that I think, given the circumstances, is remarkable. This group of complete strangers put aside their anger, their fear, and they put their plan to a vote. I doubt the decision was unanimous, nor do I think that anybody was on the understanding that it was a foolproof plan, not even close. But the decision was nonetheless made. The time to act was now.
You just have to, right? You just have to act.
Tuesday, 9:47 a.m.
Hi, baby. Baby, you have to listen to me carefully. I'm on a plane that's been hijacked. I'm on the plane. I'm calling from the plane. I want to tell you I love you. Please tell my children that I love them very much. And I'm so sorry, babe. I don't know what to say There's 3 guys. They've hijacked the plane. I'm trying to be calm. We're turned around, and I've heard that there's planes that's been flown into the World Trade Center. I hope to be able to see your face again, baby. I love you. Bye.
End of message.
Oh, dude,
From
those
this
messages.
Point, around 9:45, the evidence showed that there was a flurry of calls made by passengers to their loved ones. At the same time, they worked together to flesh out the specifics. They quietly grabbed anything they could. Flight attendants prepared hot water. The back of the plane was searched for anything useful. Jeremy, still on the phone to his wife Liz, told her about the plan and asked her what she thought. She hesitated, asking a few more questions, but she knew that this was his only choice, so she gave him a blessing.
Well,
he replied,
guess we better go get our butter knives from breakfast then.
Preparing himself for what was to come, Todd asked Lisa to recite the Lord's Prayer, and at 9:54, Tom made his 4th and final call. He and Dina talked a bit about his parents, about their girls, and then, after a long pause, he said,
"We're waiting until we're over a rural area. We're going to take back the plane."
Dina protested, but Tom held his ground.
"We can't wait for the authorities. I don't know what they could do anyway. It's up to us."
Dina became frantic.
"Don't worry, Dina. We're going to do something."
And then he hung up. At 9:57, Lisa, still on the other end of the line, listened as Todd turned to a nearby passenger and said, "Are you ready? Okay, let's roll."
Thing is, how do you get to the front without being spotted?
To protect passengers had failed that day. It's also true that our kind are stubborn beyond comprehension. And while we are perfectly capable of recognizing that the odds are minute, that doesn't stop us from trying anyway. Over the next 6 minutes, the passengers on Flight 93 fought like hell. I can't imagine what it must have felt like, even in their state of desperation, to have carried out such an act. We don't know who led the charge, nor how many passengers were involved. But what we do know, without a shadow of a doubt, is that any hijackers that were outside that cockpit stood very little chance. Inside the cockpit, the words, "Is there something? A fight?" can be made out. Now realizing what was happening, the pilot immediately put the plane into a rapid ascent. While this no doubt slowed the group down, by now, nothing could stop them. At 9:58 and 57 seconds, the CVR picked up one of the hijackers saying, "They want to get in there. Hold the door. Hold from the inside. Hold from the inside. Hold." And then, perhaps realizing just how many passengers were involved in the revolt, one of the hijackers is heard saying, "There are some guys. All those guys." A few seconds later, an American male voice could be heard screaming, "Let's get them." And then, for 46 seconds, a series of loud noises were recorded before one of the hijackers in the cockpit, now coming to terms with what was about to happen, could be heard saying the words, "There is nothing."
And 865, we have the traffic below us.
We're 56865 Cleveland Center. Roger, and I have a question for you. If you can look off your left side, almost to make it your 9 o'clock, almost your 8 o'clock. We have, I believe it is a Boeing 757. Can you see him up there, sir, and tell me an altitude if that's able?
We've got him.
What altitude does it appear to be he's at?
We're 7, he's probably 75, 8,000.
75,000 feet, sir?
Okay, he's descending. He's getting closer to our altitude. We haven't been sight yet.
That's so high.
56865. I advise you stay away from that aircraft. Go north as fast as you can.
It looks like he's rocking his wings, according to my observer. Keeps rocking back and forth.
Unbelievably, Cleveland Center, still tracking Flight 93, had radioed a nearby private aircraft to try and confirm the plane's altitude. That pilot watched on in horror as this huge 757 rocked its wings back and forth. As we now know, he was witnessing a last-ditch attempt by the hijackers to throw the passengers off and keep them out of the cockpit. And it failed. At 10:01, just outside of the cockpit door, a male voice could clearly be heard shouting, "Roll it," presumably referring to a trolley being used as a battering ram. Just under half a minute later, there was an agreement between the hijackers. It was over. There's nothing more to be done. Their plan had failed. The plane was pitched down to a 45-degree angle. Outside, the passengers continued to break into the cockpit, and it seems that at 1 minute past 10, they were successful. But it was just too late.
Damn it.
Not to have been over there. There must be thousands of such stories here this morning, Peter, of those that were the lucky ones.
Thank you, Bill. Please stay in touch as often as you can. It's now 10 minutes to 11 Eastern Time, 10 minutes to East, in 2 minutes to 8 in the West. And I'm just going to add to the chaos and the trauma of the day by saying that a large plane has now crashed just north, or shouldn't I say just, but crashed about 10 o'clock in the last 15 minutes north of Somerset County Airport, about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh.
At 10:03, United Airlines Flight 93 crashed into a field in rural Pennsylvania at 580 miles per hour, about 20 minutes flying time from Washington, D.C. The sounds of the passengers' counterattack could be heard right up to the end. It is a miracle, and I don't use that word lightly, that no additional lives were lost. Who knows what could have happened had the passengers acted just a few minutes later. It's also tempting to wonder whether or not things could have ended differently had the message gotten to the pilots sooner. And who knows, maybe they could have. But the truth is, we'll never know. What we do know for sure is that once the hijackers had made the decision to put the plane down, there was little more the passengers could do. The body of the plane was almost upside down by the time it had crashed. Still, while they might not have been able to save themselves, the passengers aboard United Airlines Flight 93 undoubtedly saved the lives of many on the ground. And while that intention was never explicitly stated, if you listen carefully to some of the passengers' words,
that is true.
I strongly suspect that stopping the plane from getting to its target was the primary objective for more of the passengers than I think we realise. Whether they chose to let other people on the plane or their loved ones know that. It's why they waited until they were over a less crowded area. It's why Todd was clear to Lisa about his probable fate that day. It's why some of the passengers, phones in their hands, chose not to even make calls in the first place. It's now believed that the hijackers' target for Flight 93 was the Capitol building. Although, for a time, military officials maintained that Flight 93 would have been intercepted before reaching its goal, a later analysis by the 9/11 Commission has all but disproved this.
Yeah.
See, the military wouldn't find out about Flight 93 from the FAA until 10:07, 4 minutes after its crash. According to the report, it's highly unlikely that fighters, who were still being given negative clearance to shoot down commercial aircraft at that time, would have been able to intercept the plane, even if they'd known about it. And you know, it's tempting to feel frustrated with this. But on the contrary, the defence of US airspace on 9/11 wasn't conducted in accord with pre-existing training and protocols. It was improvised by civilians who had never dealt with a hijacked aircraft that attempted to disappear, and by a military unprepared for the transformation of a commercial aircraft into a weapon of mass destruction. Still, in many ways, the passengers' response, emphatic and human where so much else was slow and bureaucratic, was probably the only act that substantially abated the damage that day. Many lives were lost, but many were saved. I won't pretend this isn't an intensely complicated story that merits far more dissection than I can cover in an hour or so. So I'll borrow the words from Robert Sapolsky, who put this complexity far better than I ever could. We are a miserably violent species. The single most complicated thing about that is at the same time, we're the most altruistic, most cooperative, most empathetic species on Earth. And I'll also add to that we seem to have this unparalleled capacity for getting the two the wrong way round. One person's violence is another's altruism. I've no doubt that the 4 hijackers who boarded United Airlines Flight 93 that day imagined in their hearts that they were going to witness a great act of bravery. And they did. It just wasn't their own.
That was good.